today, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about sort of how we see the market, some trends that we think are important, and of course, we're here in an Interchain conference, so more than happy to discuss some of those concepts as well. So thoughts about state of entities, Web3, the role of trust, tokenization, and of course, I'll sprinkle some meme coins into the discussion as well. All right, so quickly on Animoca Brands, if you haven't heard about us, we are an operating business that have a large investment portfolio. Today, we have over 540 companies that we've invested in Web3 really since 2017, 2018. And so what we believe in basically is this concept of a shared network, and which I'll go into later, which is very much fitting, I think, for the theme of the conference. So let's talk a little bit about sort of one area that I'm quite passionate about is sort of what does it mean to be in Web3 and what does actually tokenization actually mean? And so we know that Web3 is about the web of ownership, right? It's a way in which you can own essentially a piece of that future internet. But what is it that you actually own and how is it represented? And that ownership is represented through the token. Doesn't matter what project it is, whether it's a gaming token, a meme coin, a network, an L1, L2, it is represented through this token. But what's powerful about the token concept is that it actually represents network effects that are actually combined between both the financial and the application utility. So when you think about, for instance, networks in the classical sense of Web 2, take, for instance, in the Web 2 world, where you have all this power concentrated in these network effects, those network effects are separated from the value of the business. For instance, you could have 1 million followers on Instagram, but it has no bearing on any value that you might have in Facebook, the company. Likewise, you could be a big shareholder in Facebook. It has zero bearing on your influence on Instagram, for instance. These are completely separated concepts. And actually, Web3 and tokenization combine them, new network asset class. But all this value that they're generating comes from the fact that they own these network effects. You have to pay a fee to enter Apple, and you have to use and follow their rules. You have to pay a fee, or basically follow the rules of X or whatever, so that you can actually partake in these network effects. That's actually what makes them powerful. So in Web3, however, we have a couple things that are different. Through the token effect, you actually own a piece of the network. For instance, you're not buying an Ethereum or whatever token because of the fact that it generates incredible yield. In some cases it might, but in most cases, you're buying it because you want to partake in the benefits of the network. That can include financial utility, but also other things. And what the other thing is also interesting about Web3 is that because the network is permissionless, basically basically it becomes very interoperable. So in the example I gave you before, there's no interoperability between Google or Facebook or Apple. They don't talk to each other. They talk over very thin permissioned rails. But at Web3, which you can see now with basically whether it's staking, cross liquidity chains, interoperability of assets, transfer, they go all over the place. Meaning that when one ecosystem in Web3 accelerates in value and growth, the entire ecosystem grows as a result. And that's what we mean when we say the shared network, right? So kind of like rising tide lifts all boats. But one other thing, when we look at essentially projects and how we think of them in terms of success, we look at the generation of these network effects because we think of tokens as essentially representations of network effects. And it's important to then be able to measure the value generated from each connection. So for instance, you're not joining an Ethereum network because Vitalik sings really good Japanese. Not really, but anyway, as an example, right? You're not doing it because he's doing it. You're doing it because there's other people joining, because there's other people in the network that you're participating in. And the successful networks are the ones where you join for the network effect of the entire ecosystem rather than the job of one company or one person or one group. That's kind of what you're looking for, and that's what we're looking for in projects. And it's important to also understand that network effects are not viral effects. So for instance, when you see what's happening with Telegram, it's great for user acquisition, and you should absolutely leverage that in your projects. But just because you have lots of users doesn't mean that they become network effects. That's a big distinction. So for instance, lots of chain traffic doesn't necessarily mean that they're actually creating a network effect where they trade or transact really with each other, especially when they're maybe botted, right? And there are different types of network effects to think about as well. So when you look at, for instance, the classic form of most of the network effects that we see in many projects, they follow more like Sarnoff's law, which is more like a centralized entity. It's using a token to basically try to create a network, but all of the value and all of the power seems to be coming from the one entity. You're following that one institution or that group. When you're actually trying to break something that's much more closer to Reed's law, where the network effects come from within the ecosystems themselves, that you can basically hopefully then more measure. And that's kind of a way to measure the physical, right? It's not like a PE model. It's not like a typical growth model. Measuring network effects is, I think, a new skill that our industry actually should be very good at, for instance. All right, now other types of network effects that we see comes in the form of cultural capital. So brands, for instance, is a kind of network effect as well. When you think about basically cultural capital, things like sort of a Birkin bag versus a Bored Ape, you're not buying these things for their utility. You're buying them because they have a type of emanating network effect that comes from the brand power that's inherent. You don't buy a Rolex to tell the time, but you do buy it because it gives you some kind of network effect to the community, a recognition, for instance. And that's actually the role that NFTs play here as well. And in the gaming world, we already do this. We spend about $100 billion a year on virtual gaming assets that are all really about cultural capital and social capital, meaning they give us status, they give us reputation in the games that we play. And that's also one of the reasons why Web3 gaming is so exciting, because we can now take these rental goods and actually potentially put them on chain and create them into actual real assets. There's 3.4 billion people who play games today. And so obviously that's one area of growth market that we see driving mass adoption, not only through the type of Telegram games that you see, but also with more sort of, more sophisticated AAA games, most recently like Off the Grid. And this kind of gives you an idea of the market, right? So the gaming industry currently is almost $300 billion in size, which is bigger than music and movies combined. Whereas when you take a sort of imperfect analogy of what's the Web3 gaming companies are like, through the form of their token market cap, is a little bit about $18 billion, which kind of gives you sort of an idea of the state of the market of Web3 gaming and the potential where it might be able to go. So I kind of want to talk a little bit also about sort of meme coins and NFTs. For our interpretation, meme coins are basically the NFTs of 21, in effect, basically, in this current narrative. They are actually very much related to each other. And notice also how many of the meme coins today are now issuing NFTs as a result of having a token. So whereas previously, there was a lot of NFT collections issuing basically meme coins of their own or tokens. So it's kind of now they're kind of cross-bridging with each other. But there is a part where they function slightly differently, meaning that with meme coins, most of the activity, although there is culture and social capital involved, it's mostly economic. People are basically trading, hoping for gain, a bit of speculation, maybe some fun, a lot of gambling. Whereas with the NFT collections, once you reach a certain level, it becomes much more about cultural capital, about reputation. And that's kind of how we see that evolution over time. So that is the reason why we think we're long-term bullish on the high-value NFTs over time, because when you think about you generating value and income of some sort, eventually you want to progress to the kind of asset classes that you think give you a distinguishing factor in terms of status and cultural capital that pure fungible assets don't provide. Meaning you could have a million, but what's the difference between having 1 million cat tokens, 2 million cat tokens, and 10 million cat tokens? At one point, it's going to be something where you start to distinguish between the unique assets that you have, for example. And that's kind of how we think of the state of NFTs. And frankly, we spend more money on culture than we spend on anything else in at least the physical world. So if we think of the transplanting the physical world in the digital world, we certainly think that that will be true over time. So meme coins to us is a measure of a way to mass adopt people into basically this framework. All right. So quickly, you know this already. Why does Web3 matter? Web3 matters because value is more cross-shared, because you have ownership. And it's not perfect to say that it's distributed equally, but it's to say that value is shared between users, creators, builders, and investors. And it works because we're actually rewarding people to facilitate and use the network, which we don't do in Web2. For instance, you could be using Instagram all day and you don't get paid for it, because even though you're providing value to the network, you're bringing in customers, you're bringing in users, you're bringing in content, basically Facebook receives all that value. And I'll give you an example how we do this in the gaming business. So we spend about $100 billion a year advertising to bring in gamers to play games. That's in Web2. Most of the money goes to Facebook, Google, and Apple. How much of that money actually goes back to the gamer that you attracted? Zero. How much of that money goes into the game studios that are developing these games? Almost zero as well. So it's a highly extractive tax in the form of marketing and advertising, which is essentially basically leveraging their network effects. In Web3, we do the same thing, except we do it in the form of airdrops. The airdrop mechanism is a way to say, I want to attract you as a customer to come basically play my game or use my chain or use my system, and I will reward you for that. And that's the point, right? This is why value is distributed. But the value comes from the marketing dollars, which is a $1 trillion market, that's actually now going back to the end user who's providing value into the network. And over the last 3 years, not including this year, close to $22 billion of so-called free money was dropped, when it's actually really just the inverse of marketing. So that's really the promise and the opportunity. But we do have a problem in our space. And many of you who are thinking about token launches will notice, because it comes in the form of these Sybil attacks. Many of the recent launches have struggled because 70 to 80%, up to 70 to 80%, maybe even more, of the audiences are not actual users. So remember how I talked to you about when you build a token economy, when you build a token framework, it's about the strength of the network effect. But what kind of network effect are you building when most of the users are bots? And you can kind of see this from when people are signing up, for instance, all these users, you might have 20, 30 million users, but somehow only 1 million wallets are opened or 2 million wallets are opened. Yes, it's millions of wallets, but actually that's the issue. And then you're dropping a lot of value to people that you think are supposed to be users, but in reality are not, and they're highly extractive. So my mental model here is a little bit, they're like, basically a little bit like locust farm, sort of locusts that go from field to field to field, right, and basically just ravaging and taking value away and moving on to the next field. And that's actually harmful, we think, to the industry as a whole. And every one of you here who's thinking about launching a token project need to be mindful about how do you make sure that you're building real network effects, not just creating sort of statistics to try to get an achievement, because the long-term value will completely dissipate. And so we think the answer towards this, and this is what we're focusing on, is around reputation. So in the, in Web3, we take the concept of anonymity very seriously. But there's a point where there's a limit towards that in terms of you want to be able to build trust. But if you're imagining transacting with someone for the first time, every single time you don't know who they are, then actually you can't build a trust framework. You can't build friendships, you can't build relationships with everyone in your network is entirely anonymous. There's no such thing as a society that functions on pure anonymity. So the point is not anonymity, the point is privacy. You want to make sure that your content and your background has a certain level degree of privacy, but you don't need to be anonymous in respect to your reputation. So when you think about the physical world, actually what do you trade on? You trade mostly on your reputation. Whether you're a good programmer, what school you went to, what background you have, these are not directly measured at a form of collateral, and they are things that you invest in over time. So when you want to give an airdrop to someone, you want to give it to someone who has a reputation. You don't want to give it to just some stranger, for instance. That's how we do it in the real world, and that's kind of what's missing in the Web3 area. That's kind of an area that we're looking to build, but also every one of the projects out there, it doesn't have to be specifically Mochaverse. Think about basically how you create a reputation framework so that the customers you bring in are actual real users. And so the way we're thinking about it is we're using our network of portfolio companies to attest reputation so that over time, you have a better reputation. That means you as a project are willing to work more with that individual because he's demonstrated that he's someone who is a good user, or he's adding value to the network, or he's holding your tokens longer, or whatever measure it is that you want to sort of calculate as something that you want to give value. It creates a better ecosystem, right? Because when there's more trust, right, when there's better reputation in an ecosystem, that's actually how you also create more safety and more certainty. All right, so I'm going to close it with 2 slides on this, because I actually think that trust and safety is one big area that we deal with, but we mostly focus on trust and safety in the area of, are you keeping your wallet safe, and there's a custody, and that's one aspect. But the other aspect, of course, which is really important, is really how are the counterparties I'm dealing with? What actually are the people that I can trust to do business with? And so there's a relation that I always talk about, which is that when you have good property rights, which is basically what Web3 offers to assets, you actually have stronger economies and also more freedom. I typically talk about that a lot. And right now, the Web2 world is very much at the bottom 20 percentile, no property rights, which is also the reason why our online attention is literally worth cents on the dollar, right? I mean, all the dollar click or less. Right? That doesn't make sense. But that's kind of where we are because we're in a low property framework. But in Web3, you notice how the ARPU is higher, how the value is higher, because there's property rights. So your time and your assets online actually are a capital asset and therefore have capital appreciation potential. And of course, if you have property ownership, you have the certainty of investing in it. If you know you own it, then it's something you can transact. If you could lose it any time, then how can you actually invest in it and give it a 10 or 20 times future forward value, for instance, right? But there's the other thing that our industry really needs on top of this and why property rights works, and that actually comes to relation to trust. And that's actually, I think, the big thing that we as an industry need to solve, which we think reputation will help, but maybe other things as well. Any economy that has a high degree of interpersonal trust, not meaning necessarily trust to the government, but trust with each other, actually has very high GDPs. Why? Because I have trust that I can do business with you. I can do business with you on a handshake. I don't have to worry that you steal something from me. It makes sense. And actually, the statistics show that the countries that have a high degree of trust have much better economies. So when you think about Web3 as an economy, as an ecosystem, think about how we can build better trust through reputation or other frameworks, and you will build better economies, whether it's for your particular project or basically just for the ecosystem as a whole. Thank you very much.